The sun had dropped behind the hills when Callum Hayes rode into town with nothing but a worn saddlebag and dust in his throat. He didn't talk much, didn't ask questions, and he sure didn't make friends. Folks who knew his name whispered it with a sort of pity, not fear. Not anymore. Once he'd been something else, someone proud, who stood up straight and rode like he belonged to the land. But life had a way of taking what you thought was yours and burning it to ash. Now he carried a secret like a broken bottle in his chest, sharp and dangerous. And every mile he rode, he hoped to outrun the part of him that shattered in that fire 2 years ago. Jericho was one of those towns that wore its rot on the outside. From the moment you stepped off the main road, you could smell the greed. The saloons buzzed louder than the churches, and men with polished boots leaned in dark corners, trading favors that always ended with blood. There was no law here, not really. Just men with guns and the money to keep their sins quiet. Callum didn't care much. He wasn't looking for redemption or justice. He only came because someone left a letter with his name scrawled on it in shaky ink, sealed with the mark of a man he hoped had died years ago. The saloon doors creaked open like they were tired of all the screaming. Inside, the place was thick with smoke, sweat, and that strange quiet that settles in just before something awful happens. On a platform near the back, two girls stood lined up like cattle. Not women, girls. Couldn't have been more than 17, one barely looking old enough to hold a comb, let alone understand what kind of hell was waiting for her. A man with slick hair and a red sash tied around his arm called out prices like he was auctioning horses. The room played along, drunk and grinning. One man even slapped the table like he was celebrating a fine catch. It was a nightmare dressed up like business, and no one blinked. Not until the last name came from the auctioneer's mouth. Annie Quinn. Callum froze. He hadn't heard that name in 4 years. Not since she ran barefoot across a creek to warn him about the fire. Not since he pulled her bleeding from the barn and watched her father die trying to save their horses. She had been just a kid then, wild, kind, and half-starved from living too close to nowhere. But she had his eyes, and he never understood why until later. She was his sister. Half-sister, really, from a mother that hated him and a father who never said a word. The man who raised her was a drunk, but not the kind who sold his blood. Callum knew something was wrong. He moved before he thought, just walked through the crowd, slow like a storm rolling in. People turned. The room shifted, men reaching for their hips. But Callum didn't draw. He didn't speak. He just looked at Annie. Older now, lips pressed tight, eyes hollow. And she looked back like she knew he wasn't supposed to be real. Outside the saloon, the wind picked up. Dust swirled through the cracks in the windows. Annie blinked once, and it was all he needed. Callum kicked the saloon doors open wide, boots thudding hard against the boards. Guns were drawn in a second, but his voice cut through it first. She's not for sale. The room went quiet. No one laughed. Not because they believed him, but because they didn't. In a town like Jericho, no one did anything unless they had something to lose. Callum was dressed like a man who had nothing left. The auctioneer tilted his head. "You buying both, stranger?" Callum stepped closer. "I'm taking them." That's when the guns came out for real. But Callum didn't reach for his. He just stared the man down. That was the thing about him. He didn't talk fast, didn't shout, didn't bark orders. But when he looked at you like that, you remembered every bad thing you ever did. The men paused. Long enough. A shot cracked from the back of the saloon. Callum spun, dropped the man behind him with a single round. Another went down, trying to reload. Panic hit fast. Men scrambled, ducking for cover. Annie jumped from the platform and grabbed the other girl's hand. Callum grabbed a second. They ran. Outside, the street was empty. Callum's horse waited, restless. He threw Annie up behind the saddle, then the other girl. He climbed up and rode hard. Bullets hissed through the dark. They didn't stop riding for 3 miles. When they did, the other girl was crying. Annie climbed down slow. She didn't ask why he was there. Didn't thank him. Just stared at him like she was trying to see past the dust. Callum didn't explain. He couldn't. Because saving her wasn't why he came. Not really. He came for the letter. The one signed with a name that made his blood run cold. He came because someone from their past was back, and they wanted Annie found. Alive. Delivered. And if he didn't do it, someone else would. He hadn't decided yet. But the secret he carried, the real reason he came, wasn't gone just because he saw her eyes again. And Jericho never forgot. The fire might have gone out, but the ashes were still hot. They rode until the sky turned from ink to ash, the kind of gray morning that never quite warms up, not even when the sun shows itself. Callum led them off the trail and into a dry riverbed where the brush was thick and the rocks could hide a fire. He tied the horse, helped the girls down, and kept an eye on the ridgeline. They weren't safe yet. He doubted they ever really would be. Annie was the first to speak. She pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders and nodded at the other girl. "This is Sarah," she said, motioning to the one whose face was blotched from crying, but whose eyes never left the shadows. "We met in Ashby. A man promised work. He was lying." Callum didn't ask what the work was. He didn't need to. He just nodded. And he didn't waste time on sympathy either. Whatever softness she once had was buried under too many nights without a lock on the door. Sarah sat with her knees pulled to her chest, silent. Her eyes were sharp, though, watching everything. By mid-morning, Callum had a fire going and beans in a dented tin pan. He kept Annie close by, but she didn't say much else. Didn't ask what came next. She just sat across from him, every inch of her wound tight like a bowstring waiting to snap. Then came a sound, soft hooves on dirt. Callum rose, hand on his gun. From behind the trees came a tall rider, dressed in a long duster the color of mud. He moved slow, like he wanted them to see him. And when he pulled back his hood, Callum let out a breath that carried 1,000 unsaid things. "Luke Kane," Callum muttered. Luke dismounted with a lazy grin, as if they were old friends meeting over coffee. "Heard about the saloon," he said. "Figured I'd find you somewhere nearby." Annie stiffened. "You know him?" "We rode together," Callum said. "Once." Luke stretched, then knelt by the fire without being asked. "And we bled together. Don't forget that part." There was a time when Callum trusted Luke like a brother. They'd fought side by side during the raid on Clover Hills, watched each other's backs through blizzards and bloodbaths. But somewhere between then and now, Luke started taking jobs that left kids without parents and houses without walls. He hadn't crossed the line. He'd set it on fire. Still, Callum didn't draw on him. Not yet. He didn't have the full picture. "Why are you here?" Callum asked. Luke poked the beans with a stick. "Same reason as you, I guess. Got word Annie Quinn was still breathing. That there was a buyer willing to pay good money to get her back." Annie's face went pale. "Who?" Luke shrugged. "Didn't ask. Don't plan to deliver. Not after what I saw back in Jericho. That ain't my kind of job." Callum didn't believe him. Not all the way. Luke was always 3 steps ahead and never walked into a trap he didn't lay himself. Still, something about the way he said it, quiet, almost regretful, made Callum hesitate. Then Sarah spoke for the first time. "That man at the auction, he didn't run the place. He answered to someone. I heard him say it, before the bidding started. Said the boss was coming soon." Luke turned. "Boss?" Sarah nodded. I think they were keeping us there until someone important arrived. That's why they didn't touch us yet." Callum frowned. That made sense. Too much sense. Annie wasn't just another girl to be passed around and discarded. She was wanted, not for what she'd done, but for what someone thought she could undo. That was when the other piece clicked into place. A woman named Esther Langston. She was known from Dakota Territory to the Southern Canyons. Some called her a widow. Others called her a witch. But what she truly was, no one knew for sure. Esther had power, the kind that didn't need a gun to kill. And years ago, she'd lost something. A child. Rumor was, Annie had been there when it happened. The girl's silence wasn't just trauma. It was survival. Callum stared at Annie. "Do you know a woman named Esther?" Annie's mouth opened, then shut. She looked away. Luke rubbed his chin. "There it is. She thinks I did something," Annie said finally. Her voice was brittle. "She thinks I killed her son. But I didn't. I swear I didn't." Callum believed her. But belief wasn't enough out here. Not when someone like Esther had men with badges and men without souls chasing ghosts on her behalf. Luke stood, brushing dirt off his coat. "Then you've got more than bounty hunters on your back. You got vendetta, and those don't end until someone's in the ground." Annie looked at Callum. "Why did you come for?" The days that followed stretched long and harsh, each one feeling like a slow drag through some unseen current, pulling, testing, never quite letting go. The ragged group, Callum, Annie, Sarah, and Luke, moved through scrubland and dry creek beds, cutting through terrain that offered little shelter and even less comfort. There were no more clear paths, only instinct and hope, but something deeper began to shift beneath their silence. What started as survival had started to become something else, something more fragile. A connection, a thread. And in the West, where the line between survival and surrender was razor thin, that kind of connection was dangerous, because it meant they had something to lose. Callum noticed it first, not just in Annie's eyes, but in himself. The way he caught her watching the tree lean before they made camp. The way her hand sometimes hovered at her side, not quite reaching for a weapon, but not letting go either. He found his gaze lingering longer on her silhouette by the fire, her features half lit by the glow. She was all sharp edges and quiet strength, but there were moments, a half smile, a glance that softened, that felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. One night, under a stretch of stars too bright to ignore, Annie sat beside him and spoke about the river she'd grown up near. She talked about how the water never stopped moving, no matter what tried to dam it. Her voice was steady, but her eyes shimmered like the river she missed. Callum didn't interrupt. He just listened, letting the silence between her words wrap around him like something sacred. She wasn't just someone who'd endured. She was someone who had found a way to keep living. That difference mattered. Sarah changed too. The once guarded, steely girl began to let moments through the cracks. Her notebook, once filled with escape plans and maps, had become a quiet confession of what she missed. She drew things, a sprig of wildflowers they'd passed near the ridge, the lines of Annie's face as she slept, Luke's bent posture as he whittled wood by the fire. One night, Callum caught her staring into the flames, her hands idle for once. Tears slid down her face with no sound, no sobbing, just a quiet unraveling. When he moved closer, she didn't shy away. She didn't speak either. She didn't need to. Grief has a language of its own. Even Luke, distant and gruff as he was, began to shift. At first, it was just the small things, keeping watch longer than asked, setting traps to catch extra food, throwing his coat over Sarah when she shivered. But then came the stories. Late at night, when the others had drifted to sleep, he'd speak in a low voice to Callum. Tales from the war, regrets buried deep beneath bravado, names he hadn't said in years. He'd once been more than a hired gun, more than the man with the scars on his knuckles. And beneath all the grit and swagger was someone who carried guilt like a second skin. He didn't say it outright, but Callum knew. Luke had run from something too. But with every step they took away from Jericho, danger followed. The world didn't forget Esther Langston so easily. Word traveled fast, even in the emptiest places. A traveler at a stream, a woman at a trading post. They all brought scraps of news. Esther was stirring something dark. She was calling in debts for men who owed her blood and coin. There were whispers of mercenaries, men who had no home, no mercy, and no reason to stop. Their orders were simple: bring Annie back alive, or leave her body for the vultures. One night, camped near a narrow creek where the water ran black and cold, Annie let her mask slip. The others had gone quiet, the fire little more than coals. She sat beside Callum, knees pulled to her chest, arms wrapped around herself like armor. Then, in a voice just above a whisper, she spoke. About the night she fled Esther's home. About the look in Esther's eyes when she realized Annie wouldn't bend. about the boy who had died because Annie had tried to help him, and how she'd carried that guilt like a chain ever since. Her voice cracked when she said his name. She hadn't spoken it aloud in years. Callum didn't say much. He just reached out, gently placing a hand on her shoulder, grounding her. No grand promise, just presence. Sometimes that was enough. Their group was becoming something else entirely, not just survivors, but something closer to a family. A makeshift one, stitched together with fear and quiet courage. Every day, without gunfire, felt like a small miracle. Every time Sarah laughed, even softly, it felt like a promise that maybe, just maybe, they could build something beyond this chase. But even as hope grew, so did the risk. Hope had a way of making you feel exposed. They made camp closer to the mountains, where the air grew thinner and the nights bit harder. Sarah's cough came back with a vengeance, deep and raw. She tried to hide it, but they all heard. Callum and Luke took turns sitting beside her, watching the shadows stretch and shrink through the night. They whispered plans when the others slept, how far they could push the next day, how long Sarah could hold out. Every snapped twig made their hands jump to weapons. Every rustle of wind sounded like boots on dry leaves. Then came the morning Luke returned with news that froze the blood in Callum's veins. He'd spotted riders on the ridge, Esther's men. They weren't far. And worse, they had someone with them. A prisoner. Someone who knew the trails, the campsites, the places they'd stopped. Someone who could name their route and rhythm. The realization hit hard. They'd been betrayed. Or at the very least exposed. Time was gone. There would be no more slow planning. The decision was simple. Run and be hunted or stand and fight. Callum stood silent for a long time, staring at the cold morning light breaking over the trees. He looked at Annie, her hand resting gently on Sarah's forehead, and at Luke, who stood like a man ready to die if he had to. Then he looked at Sarah, her breathing ragged, her small frame curled up against her coat like it could still protect her. And something inside him settled. He wouldn't run again. Not from Esther, not from his past, and not from the people who now meant everything. He didn't say it aloud, but the promise was clear in his eyes. They would face what was coming together, because some things were worth risking it all for. And this time, he wouldn't let fear decide who he was. The cold mountain wind sliced through their camp like a blade, chilling bones and dreams alike. What had been a fragile hope began to splinter beneath the weight of the threats closing in. It was Luke who found the tracks first. Deep hoof prints mixed with the tread of many boots scattered through the loose dirt and cracked rock. Not just hunters anymore, but a small posse, organized and relentless. Esther Langston's reach was longer than they had imagined. They were not merely fleeing shadows, but chasing a storm that had no mercy. Callum gathered the group in a circle that night, the fire flickering low between them. Annie's face was pale, eyes hollow where there had once been a spark. Sarah coughed through ragged breaths, clutching the leather notebook like a talisman. Even Luke, the ever-calm stranger, showed signs of strain, his jaw clenched tight, a storm hidden behind those hard eyes. "We can't outrun them," Callum said quietly, voice thick with exhaustion. "Not in this terrain, not with how close they are." Annie's voice broke when she answered. "Then what? We stand and wait to be dragged back like cattle? Or worse?" That question hung in the cold air, heavier than the night. No one had an answer, but it was clear the path ahead would demand more than just running. It would require courage none of them felt they had left. They tried to rest, but sleep was a stranger. Every creak in the trees, every crack of twig, set nerves on edge. Sarah's fever spiked, and Callum's hands shook as he tried to stanch the girl's burning skin with wet cloths. Annie stayed by her side, whispering stories that once belonged to a safer world, stories she barely remembered herself. The girl's weaknesses became glaring vulnerabilities, pulling Callum deeper into the harsh reality they faced. Luke vanished again just before dawn. No explanation, no warning. When he returned, He carried a grim expression and a bundle wrapped in rough cloth. He dropped it at Callum's feet and met his gaze. This came from the man holding our trail. They've got prisoners, more than just us. People who might have known too much. Callum unwrapped the bundle slowly. Inside lay a torn piece of fabric, a dress stained with dried blood, and a note scrawled in uneven letters. She knows where you'll be. She wants you to suffer. Annie's lips trembled, and for the first time, Callum saw the weight of fear crush the defiant spark in her eyes. Esther's hunting ghosts, she whispered, and I'm the one she's after. Days bled into each other, the group slipping deeper into a world of distrust and despair. The mountains offered shelter, but also isolation, a cage with no bars, where the walls were the bitter wind and the constant threat of discovery. Arguments flared, over food, over decisions, over who should carry the burden of hope and who was too broken to hold it anymore. One evening, after a bitter fight that left the camp cold and silent, Annie confronted Callum. You're hiding something. You came here for me. Yes, but not just for me. What aren't you telling me? Callum looked away, the secret lodged heavy in his chest. The letter that led him here was not just from a stranger, but from someone he once called a friend, and a man who had betrayed him in the worst way possible. I thought delivering you would end the hunt. I was wrong. Annie's gaze sharpened. Then what now? Before Callum could answer, a sudden noise shattered the tense quiet. A scream, raw and close. They scrambled toward the sound, hearts pounding. Sarah lay on the ground, pale and shaking, her hand clutched tight over a fresh wound. A man loomed over her, rifle raised, eyes wild and merciless. Luke was the first to draw, a shot ringing out that knocked the attacker back. But the moment broke something inside the group. The line between hunter and hunted blurred until no one knew which side they were truly on. That night, as the fire died down to embers, Callum sat alone, the weight of failure pressing on him. Annie joined him, voice barely a whisper. We're all broken, she said, but maybe that's why we're still standing. Callum nodded, knowing the fight ahead would demand everything they had, and more. Esther Langston was coming, and this time, there would be no running from the darkness she carried. The morning broke cold and sharp, a wind slicing down from the peaks, scraping across the camp like a blade. The embers of their fires struggled to stay alive, thin trails of smoke curling upward and disappearing into the gray light. Callum sat alone on a jagged rock, elbows on knees, his hands hanging between them like the weight they carried. The mountains in the distance stood like frozen sentinels, hard and unyielding. He watched the sky shift from indigo to a bleak steel blue and felt it in his bones. This was the day everything had to change. The past couldn't be outrun anymore. It was no longer a shadow at his back. It was a voice, a wound, a reckoning. And it had a name, Esther Langston. He turned his head toward the camp without standing, his gaze moving slowly over the people who had come to mean more than he ever expected. Annie stood stiffly by the fire, arms wrapped around Sarah, whose skin was clammy and pale, but whose breathing had steadied in the night. Annie's eyes were rimmed with exhaustion, but her posture was still that of someone braced against a storm. Her fear never showed in her voice, only in the way her fingers twitched when she thought no one was watching. Luke sat just beyond them, oiling his revolver with a kind of mechanical calm. His eyes lifted every so often to meet Callum's, not asking, not offering, just knowing. They were all waiting for something. So was he. What they didn't know was that this moment wasn't just about Esther. Not for Callum. It was about something older, deeper, a betrayal that had carved out a part of him and left it to rot. Years ago, he trusted someone with everything he had. A friend, a brother in arms. And that man had sold him out. Not for gold, not even for power, but out of fear. That betrayal had set him on the path that led here. Through Clover Hills, across state lines, bleeding and hunted, breaking one promise after another, just to survive. He had buried it, tried to outrun it, but every step brought him closer to this. The choice to keep running or to turn and face the thing that had broken him. They broke camp in silence, the tension settling like frost on their shoulders. The mountain paths grew thinner, sharper, as if the earth itself wanted to test their resolve. With every step, Callum's memory sharpened, came clearer. The night fire lit the alley behind the saloon. The sting of betrayal when the badge came down hard across his face. The sick understanding that his name had been traded like a coin. He had lived in hiding ever since, not just from the law, but from what it had turned him into. Annie walked just ahead of him, one hand on Sarah's shoulder to steady her as they climbed. There were things they had never spoken aloud, things they both carried. The fear of being seen, the shame of what had been done to them, and what they had done in return. Callum had seen it in Annie's eyes the first night they met. That quiet, steady pain. He didn't have to ask what caused it. He just recognized it as kin. They reached the canyon by mid-morning, the rocks slick with patches of old ice. Callum was the first to hear the voices. Esther's men, laughing, careless, thinking themselves the hunters. In an instant, the group scattered to cover, ducking behind boulders and brush. Sarah crouched low, her breathing shallow but even. Annie clutched her coat tighter around her. Luke cocked his pistol with practiced ease. And Callum stood up. He didn't explain. He didn't ask permission. He just stepped out into the canyon, into the open. The air was still, the kind of stillness that comes before something breaks. The footsteps rounded the bend, and then they were there. Esther walked at the front, her coat unbuttoned, her revolver resting easy in her hand. Her eyes locked on Callum with the cold precision of a hawk sighting prey. She stopped a few yards from him. "You always were a fool for lost causes," she said. Her voice was low, dry, but carried the weight of old wounds and harder truths. "You think standing in the open makes you brave?" Callum's grip on his gun didn't tighten. It stayed loose, low, ready. "I think running's finished." Esther tilted her head, eyes narrowing. "You're here for them, aren't you? Not even for yourself." "I'm here," he said, "because I finally know who I am and who I'm not." The silence stretched until Esther's lip curled. "You were nothing when I found you. A stray dog with a gun and a guilty conscience. Don't pretend you're righteous now." Callum took a slow breath. "You don't scare me anymore." She raised her gun. "You should be scared." He didn't flinch. "So should you." It could have ended there, with blood and ash. But something shifted. Annie stepped out behind him, voice trembling but loud enough to echo through the canyon. "Enough. This doesn't end the way you think, Esther. You're not the judge of our lives." Esther looked at her, something flickering in her face. Recognition, memory, pain. A breath passed between them, shared and sharp. And for the first time, Esther looked uncertain. Her gun lowered just slightly. "You don't know what they did to me," she said, voice breaking like ice beneath weight. "I don't," Annie replied, "but I know what you did to us, and I won't carry your grief anymore." A full heartbeat passed. Then, too, Callum took a step forward, lowered his gun. Not in surrender, in choice. "We walk out of here," he said. "All of us. You can chase ghosts if you want, but we're not yours anymore." Esther stood frozen for a moment longer. Then, without a word, she turned and walked away, her men hesitating before following her. Dust rose in their wake, and then they were gone. No victory, no cheering, just the cold and the quiet, and the feeling that something heavy had been laid down. Back at camp, Sarah's fever broke that night. Luke, usually reserved, sat beside her and told her stories from his youth, his laughter breaking the shell that had surrounded him for so long. Annie took Callum's hand as they sat near the fire, not for warmth, but for grounding, for presence. He looked into her eyes and saw something he hadn't felt in years: trust. The shadows still lingered, but they were no longer hunted by them. They had stared them down. They had chosen to live. And in that choice, they found the first step toward peace. The sun crept slowly over the edge of the horizon, casting golden threads of light across the ragged clearing where the group had finally stopped running. The heat of the day had not yet arrived, and the morning held a kind of stillness that felt sacred, soft, and alive, like a breath held between chapters. After so many days of fear, gunfire, and unrelenting motion, the silence now felt like a benediction. The air was cool, touched with the scent of dust and pine, and the sky above stretched wide and impossibly blue. The group, Callum, Annie, Sarah, and Luke, sat in that stillness, each one marked by hardship, but tempered too by the quiet glow of endurance. They had survived something brutal and unrelenting, and though none of them said it aloud, they each felt a shift. They were no longer just survivors. They were something more. Annie knelt beside Sarah, whose small body curled under a worn blanket. Her fever had broken some time before dawn, and her breaths now came slow and even. The relentless cough had quieted, and though she remained pale, there was color creeping back to her cheeks. Annie smoothed Sarah's hair with gentle fingers, her eyes filled with something she hadn't dared show before, tenderness unguarded, full of hope. She spoke to Sarah in whispers, not promises but possibilities. She painted quiet pictures of a life not defined by fear, of a place where children laughed without checking over their shoulders, where the ghosts of the past could finally be laid to rest. These weren't fantasies anymore. Annie let herself believe in them, just a little, as if speaking them aloud could make them real. And maybe they could. Callum watched the two of them, his heart tightening and then softening with every quiet word Annie shared. For so long he had lived with the weight of what he could not fix, the lies he could not save, the wrongs he could not undo. But here, in this fragile moment, he saw something blooming, something real. He moved closer, his hand reaching for Annie's, their fingers sliding together like they'd done it 1,000 times. No declarations, no confessions, just touch, warm and solid, a small miracle between two people who'd been forged by fire. The look they exchanged was enough. It held everything they could not say: grief and resilience, sorrow and possibility, fear and love. A few yards away, Luke stood with his back to them, his eyes fixed on the valley that stretched toward the horizon. He had always been a man of few words and many shadows, haunted by a past he never spoke of. But now, the set of his shoulders had eased. The sharpness in his eyes had softened into something that almost resembled peace. He had come with them out of necessity, out of obligation. Somewhere along the way, though, necessity had become choice. In the bond they had formed, raw, imperfect, and unspoken, Luke had found a place to belong. Not because anyone had asked it of him, but because he had offered it freely. That was the kind of loyalty that didn't come easy in the West. And it was all the more powerful because of it. As the morning grew warmer, they packed what little they had and began to move. Their steps were slow but steady, the earth firm beneath their boots. The trees overhead whispered in the breeze, and birds called from somewhere unseen. It was a kind of beauty they hadn't been able to see while running. Now, it was impossible to miss. Every footfall felt like a claim laid on something new. The world ahead was still wild, still dangerous, but it was open, too. The trail curved toward the distant edge of settlement, a promise of shelter, maybe even home. No one said it, but they all felt it. They were not the same people who had fled the fire. They walked together, sometimes in silence, sometimes exchanging soft words or glances, but always within reach of one another. Annie carried Sarah, whose head rested on her shoulder, eyes fluttering open now and then with a faint smile. Luke kept watch from the rear, his hand never far from the revolver at his hip, but even that, now, felt more like reassurance than threat. And Callum led them forward, not because he had all the answers, but because he had finally let himself believe there could be more than running. There would be hard days ahead. Callum knew that. Healing was not a line you crossed, but a path you kept choosing. There would be nights when Sarah woke screaming, or when Annie flinched at the sound of boots and gravel. There would be moments when Luke would vanish into himself again, and Callum would question whether he could carry the weight of what lay behind and what still lay ahead. But none of those fears held the power they once did, because now they had something to come back to: each other. And when they reached the next town, it wasn't with the desperation of fugitives, but with the quiet, steady dignity of people who had earned every step of freedom. They didn't need fanfare. They didn't need to be welcomed like heroes. They only needed a place to begin. A roof that didn't leak. A bed not made of dirt. A chance to lay down the burden, even for a little while. And in time, maybe more. A school for Sarah, a garden for Annie, a porch where Callum could sit in peace, a place for Luke to put down his rifle and pick up a hammer. As the town's outline came into view, shimmering in the morning light, a soft breeze lifted the dust at their feet. They paused for a moment just before crossing into the edge of it and looked at one another. No one needed to speak. It was written on their faces, in the quiet curve of Callum's smile, in the warmth of Annie's eyes, in the steadiness of Luke's nod. They had walked through fire and come out whole. And under the wide, wild sky of the West, they stepped forward together into something new, something hard won, something true.